talking about the founders of and histories, the founders and history of the vegan movement. So
Yes.
yeah,
And some
um,
of the nuances in between that often don't get talked about.
yes, because of course, if we want to really know what veganism is, we've got to go back to what the founders said, because they were the ones that came up with it, weren't they?
Yeah, and obviously lived and breathed and embodied it too. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it often amazes me that in 2024, the amount of people that come on here with their smartphones in their hands and say, "Oh, it's really difficult to do this," and it's like, can you imagine being in their shoes?
Well. I mean, it was
I mean,
hard
even
enough.
for you too, it was incredibly difficult
Well,
in comparison to right now. But yeah,
I
you can
mean,
go back even further than that.
I became vegan in '72, which was that would have been 28 years after the Vegan Society was formed, wouldn't it?
Oh, I always thought it was 1872.
1872. Oh, yeah, sorry, no. That means I would have been vegan before the Vegan Society was formed, wouldn't it? I would be the original vegan. Uh, yeah, it was like 28 years. And it was hard enough back. I mean, Roger been vegan almost as long as me. He became vegan a few years later, didn't you, Roger? And
Oh,
I mean, back
quite a bit. It was 7 years later. I was.
7 years later, but even then, um, I mean, we had the situation back in the early '70s where it wasn't compulsory for the products um, to be listed on food. On bread, for instance, they didn't have to put a list of ingredients, and on lots of other food products, they didn't have to put a list. And where they did put something on it, it wasn't necessarily everything that was in it. So it was like really difficult to determine.
One of the first campaigns, wasn't it, to get labelling, or at
Yes,
least.
and I mean, a few years later that succeeded, and I think a bit later on in the '70s, the labelling came in. But way back, I mean, way back in the early '70s, for instance, I mean, most bread wasn't even suitable for vegetarians. Most bread contained animal fat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I mean, I especially have quite often been quite hard on the Vegan Society, but one of the things that definitely they should be credited for is things like that and working tirelessly to make sure even now that products, if they're vegan or suitable for vegans, are labelled as so. That's one of the things that they've been a constant sort of thorn in the side of companies for.
yes, yeah, and the thing, what sustained us was we said, right, um, we're going to do our utmost to avoid contributing to the you know to the exploitation and oppression of other animals. That was our starting point, and so we know we're going to do our utmost to avoid animal products, even if that's difficult. Even if that's difficult, because it's far more difficult for the animals that are exploited and that are slaughtered than it is for us to find products that don't contain you know that don't contain meat or don't contain dairy or eggs or anything like that. It was easier for us to do that than for the animals to lose their lives. So that's what sustained us, even though it was difficult. But we were determined to stick with it.
Yeah, it just shows you, doesn't it, that kind of the further you go back, that everyone's kind of connection with the why was the first thing that was established. Whereas now, quite often, the why gets, well, sometimes even forgotten from the conversation completely, whilst we focus on how you can be healthy or how you can still go to the gym or any of these other things. And the actual ethical sort of framework behind it gets forgotten. Whereas once upon a time, that was always
It
what
was the
motivated
it was the
everybody.
because it's the most important thing,
Yeah.
because it was still possible. It was difficult, and it could be complicated at times, to live as a vegan, but it was possible to do so, and we weren't losing our lives, unlike you know the animals.
Yeah.
that you used for food we're using our lives. Our situation was still massively better than theirs. So like we would tell, and that's the thing. And I think that's what that's what I always emphasise for people to think about. The reason to the reason to kind of to um, to consume products that are suitable for vegans rather than animal products isn't because we've got all these you know vegan friendly, so to speak, products now that are similar to animal products. That isn't the reason. The reason is that by consuming animal products, you're contributing to the slaughter and suffering and exploitation, oppression of other animals. And we shouldn't be doing that. We should be avoiding that. And that's the first thing.
There's a great question in the chat. We'll have to come back to that. Why aren't some of the big animal charities like the RSPCA advocating for veganism? We'll have to come back to that. Let's not forget that.
That's a very, very topical.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a very topical question. That is.
And yeah, it'd be very good to come back to. You see, because that's the kind of everything flowed from that. Everything flowed from a refusal. Everything flowed from our refusal to contribute to the exploitation and oppression of other animals. Everything flowed from that.
Well, it's funny though, Ronnie, because it was a refusal that created the vegan social movement too.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm not going to contribute to that. I'm not going to be part of that, and I'm going to seek to live without being part of that. And it started from there, and then we set about working out where we could get obtain stuff that we could eat, and all that kind of thing. And it was.
I mean, I thought it was really interesting. Obviously, we've talked loads of times over the years about the fact that Donald Watson and a few others were conscientious objectors. But it wasn't until I was re-listening to my own narration of his chat with George Roger that he gives the detailed reasons for that. So obviously he was opposed to, what men were doing to other men, so to speak, or humans were doing to other humans. But
yes.
Also in the back of his mind, a key part of why he didn't want to sign up was because he could be given some sort of conscription service in the UK, which could have been at a slaughterhouse, for example.
Oh yes.
It wasn't just the fact that he opposed the war. It was also the fact that he didn't want to basically be dictated, hey, you're going to have to go and work at a place that you fundamentally oppose. So, yeah, I thought that was really telling too, that played on a number of their minds, even before the Vegan Society was founded.
Yes, and that's,
Is that the interview where he says that he doesn't want to kill anyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because it's part of madness. I mean, war's a madness, isn't it? And why be part of that? Why be part of that? Why be part of that kind of crazy thing? Of course.
It also kind of demonstrates something that quite often gets forgotten too. That obviously we talk about the year that the Vegan Society was founded, and obviously this year, especially coming up with 80-year anniversary, it's especially special. But we forget that probably for 2, if not 3 years before that, these conversations were ongoing. And if we look at, say, just the anecdotal existence of John Cross, who's been vegan for longer than the Vegan Society has existed, we know that these people, at the very least, the founding members, were already living these lives and already avoiding animal products to the best of their ability, way before the society had a name.
Oh yes. And I mean, going back in history, go back centuries, there were people who avoided animal products. It's just that they didn't, the word vegan hadn't been coined at that time.
It just showed, even before they put a name on it, they were doing it.
Yeah, it brings us to the first point we want to say, or I did, in the sense that when we talk about the vegan social movement, we're not talking about the first people that ate a plant-based diet, and we're not talking about the first people who cared about our fellow animals. What we are talking about are the first people that is known in history to have come together to form a social movement organization, which they called a cause. So they called it the vegan cause, right? And so that's what we're saying. We're not saying these are the first people to do virtually anything, but they were the first people to come together to make a political cause, and also they gave the movement its name. So in that sense, that's their importance as far as I can see.
Yes, and they also, also defined what it meant to be vegan, didn't they? What that would.
Eventually.
Well, I think that's another key part of this. I mean, obviously, the leading up to the founding of the society, there was lots of communication that went back and forth via like the vegetarian messenger and everything else. But we also have to factor in that obviously there was no internet then, there was no email, so everything was done sort of like old-fashioned mail style in the middle of a war. So I can't imagine that Donald's letter to Leslie Cross was much of a priority and all these kind of things. And there'd have been a whole lot of post service that was delayed or no longer working or all these kind of things. So there'd have been a number of problems, and that would have extended even after. So I would imagine trying to put together some sort of democracy or some sort of like paperwork between a group that everybody agrees on would have been quite difficult without getting together. Because I mean, the first draft of the Constitution would have needed to have been agreed upon by all the members before it was printed.
Oh yes, it would have been a very, all a very lengthy and
Yeah, I mean, you think these
complicated
days,
process.
if we were doing that, we could literally put together a couple of Zoom calls and get it banged out in a week. Whereas these people could have been communicating for 12 months just to agree on basic principles that they all shared.
Yes, yes.
I like the name.
Yeah, exactly. Little things like that. It's not as simple as like a phone conversation and it was sorted. It was a case of someone would have to send a letter. Someone would have to read the letter. Someone else would have to read the letter. Then they'd all have to respond, and then they'd have to compare and agree and all these things. It would be quite difficult to actually come to a kind of democratic agreement between everybody. You'd have to wait for everybody's letters to come in too. And if one letter get lost, you'd have to wait for them to resend it so that their vote was counted. Like, yeah, it'd be quite a difficult process when you think about it, in amongst all the other things that are going on.
Okay, you brought up the vegetarian messenger, Andy. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting because from about the beginning of the 20th century, so 1900, that's when the kind of non-dairy vegetarianism debate started, right? And it went all the way through to 1944, right? And that's a really interesting thing. It was disrupted by the First World War, as you can imagine, and then by the Second World War, but not as much, funny enough. I'm not quite sure why that was. But there was quite a lot of vegetarians at the time who became uneasy about consuming eggs and dairy. And so when they articulated that, it created a big debate for years and years and years, right? And even the publication of the first vegan cookery book, which I think was 1910 as well. So, everything was there, but as it almost, it took that long for the argument to play itself out. As you're saying, you have to wait for the vegetarian messenger, which I think might have been 4 or 5 times a year, right? And so that's how you correspond.
I think it was quarterly, yeah. So 4 times a year. I mean, that's something that I always think is really interesting anyway. And that's the same, obviously, for even the vegan news when it first started, that we're still only talking about quarterly. So we're talking about every 3 months that an issue comes out. So if you sent a letter in January, you're not going to read that letter even printed till March. So no one can respond to it until at least March. And then they've got to wait 3 more months. So yeah, it takes a long time to have a conversation.
Well, the upside of that, though, Andy, is the fact that the correspondence was very thoughtful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether, I think they did. It seems like from what Donald says that they do print pretty much every letter. And you look at them and some of them are very concise, well thought out questions because they know they've got to wait for an answer and the answer's important. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's not exactly kind of internet speed, is it? So, but you often get the impression nowadays that people kind of type before they think. And of course, that wasn't the case with this correspondence, which took so long. So then we're at this kind of refusal thing, which is really interesting in the history of the vegan social movement, which is that at first they just wanted to be part of the vegetarian movement, but they wanted to have a non-dairy section. and the Vegetarian Society refused. They said no, they want to concentrate on opposing flesh consumption. And so they advised the vegans, or well, they weren't called vegans at the time, they advised the non-dairy vegetarians to go off and do their own thing, which is exactly what happened in 1944. And it was a real blessing for the movement, because it meant by within a decade, vegan philosophy had evolved. I don't think that would have happened if the vegans had been like a subsection of the vegetarians.
No, I totally agree with that. If we'd have been given like a sister section, say non-dairy vegetarians, and that was the name,
Yeah,
this movement would have never been a movement. It would have just been an extension of a diet.
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
I mean, it's kind of
you think
obvious
how
now, isn't it?
diluted it already is, and that was the ethical framework it began with. So can you imagine if it started off as just a sister to a diet? Yeah, it's the best thing that ever happened, them saying no.
Indeed. Right, shall we move on to, well, one thing that really affected you, Andy, was when you researched the history and you realized the significance of World War II.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it seems really silly that for a while, the fact that it was founded during World War II was actually kind of like part of my spiel that I would regularly talk to people on the street about and make reference to, but I'd never actually genuinely thought in depth what that meant and actually what that would have been like to live through and go through. And it's just like, I mean, with all that considered, and you're still being so selfless and so sort of like considerate of others and respectful of others that you're going to consider making a movement that essentially challenges everything that's going on in a massive scale. I mean, there's a war that is affecting millions and millions of people and billions of animals, and that's the time that you stand up and say, no, we oppose all of this, and we're going to tell you why. I just think it's incredible to even think about that. Like, even people doing that right now would seem remarkable and courageous, but doing it then was just, it's just a constant sort of like motivation, I suppose, now when I think about it.
Yeah. Hey, Ronnie, how long you been vegan? 51, 52 years now, is it?
52, yeah. In 1972, I became vegan.
Okay. I'm just answering somebody in the...
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so between us, I mean, I'm only the tiny little sliver at the end, but between us, we've done a century.
All right.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
If you add the three of us up, like I said, I'm just that little slither at the end, but still, yeah, between the three of us, we've done a century.
Yes. Yeah. And, you know, and things have massively changed. I mean, anyone now that says to me it's difficult to live as a vegan, I just don't understand it at all. You know, having, you know,
But I don't want to deviate too far from the actual subject,
yeah,
but I think it's
yeah.
fascinating as well that not only that you two did it for the length of time that you have, but that you've both been to prison as well, which must have made it really difficult. Because you haven't even got a whole lot of, I mean, especially like prison then. It's not like prison now where you can make demands and your solicitor will click their fingers and make them happen. You know, you're talking about proper prison.
Well, I think it was just that because, I mean, and I think it needs to be pointed out that the reason why Roger and myself were sent to prison was for actions, was for animal liberation activities.
Yes, yeah, of
We
course.
weren't your normal type. We weren't bank robbers or burglars or anything like that.
No, I mean,
Stealing
that's
candy
a
from
key point.
babies.
In fact, yeah, you were sent to prison for doing heroes' work, essentially. Yeah.
Well, it was for really mainly for causing damage to places like, you know, animal research laboratories and fur shops, and you know, all sorts of establishments connected with the exploitation and oppression of other animals, and basically that's what we were sent to prison for. But the thing was, when I first went in prison, and said I was a vegan, they didn't know what a vegan was. They'd never heard of it before, so I had to explain that to start with, because it wasn't, you know, the word wasn't at all familiar to people in those days. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
Can you just say it now, Ronnie? When you go to prison now, can you just say?
yes,
I would imagine so.
I
Yeah,
think
I would
I
say
think
that
so.
it's
I
yeah.
think if you're in prison now and you say you're a vegan, then they are obliged to provide you with a vegan diet. I think that's I that was certainly the right that was kind of won by. I think it was the Vegan Society, and then there was an organisation called the Vegan Prisoners Support Group, and they campaigned to get the status of vegans recognised in prison. And I think it ended up with there was a transition. I mean, when I first went in and said I was a vegan, they said, "Well, we don't recognise that. We'll give you a vegetarian diet, and you'll just have to eat what you can out of the vegetarian diet." You see, so I mean, ironically, I went on hunger strike to get a vegan diet, which seems strange that somebody refusing to eat food in order to get food. But
But it
but
also, again, also though,
yeah,
Ronnie, it goes back to that the strong ethical connection that you weren't willing to break. You know, if
oh,
it was just a
absolutely,
diet,
yes,
then obviously
yes.
it would have been the first thing you'd have gone, well, yeah, no problem, I'll eat whatever's going.
Oh no, no, no. I was steadfast, and in the end, after 10 days they agreed to give me a vegan diet. And the guy that was in the prison officer that was in charge of the kitchen came to see me and sat down with me and said, "Right, let's work out a vegan diet." He said we haven't got a lot of money to spend, so it's got to be simple. And I said, "Well, I don't care. I'm quite happy with simple as long as it's vegan." And
Just think, Ronnie. If they'd refused, we would have had to listen to these years and years of you waffling on, wouldn't we?
no, that's right. Yeah, it would have. There would have been a plus side to it, I suppose, in that respect.
Well,
Uh,
actually, one plus thing. Do you remember this, Ronnie? There's the fact that people are always talking about, oh, the plant-based diet is so bad and all this kind of stuff and all that. But do you remember how jealous the other prisoners were?
well, yes. You see, when in those early days, I mean, I won the right to a vegan diet, but that only applied to me. And when I went to different prisons, they gave me a vegan diet because they thought, well, give this guy a vegan diet, otherwise he causes trouble. But it wasn't a universal. I didn't win that right for all vegans, and it was really only the work of first of all the Vegan Society, then the Vegan Prisoner Support Group that actually won that right for vegans, and it went through a transitionary phase really um, where prisoners had a right to a vegan diet if they were members of the Vegan Society and could produce the Vegan Society membership card. That was the case for a while, and then that that kind of got dispensed with, and all you had to do, because if someone was a vegetarian, they didn't have to have a card from the Vegetarian Society, or if someone was say a Jew or a Muslim, and they needed a diet according to their religion, they didn't have to have any proof. They could just say what they were, and they got the diet. You see, so it was unfair that vegans had to produce a card.
They don't do cards anymore, I don't think. You just get a badge now.
I think well the Vegan Society, yeah, the Vegan Society still does a card. It's not the same as it's not the card. It's a rather more fancy card now than the card we had.
Oh, I've
In,
not seen the card. I've only seen the
yeah,
pin badges.
yeah, no, they get no because I'm still a member of the Vegan Society, and I get a card. I get sent a card every year. Um,
It'll be a plastic now, won't it?
it's like a card. It's like a plastic card, and it's a bit more because I think the card was it a red card back in the day.
Yeah, it was deep red. Yeah,
Just a red. It was just a kind of plain red card, but now it's got a kind of fancy design on it. It's a bit more.
it was very simple, which is good because
Yeah.
we had to forge it in the end.
Well, that's right. Yeah, because we thought it kind of rather unfair that. But you see, it's true that you see the vegan diet was actually a lot a lot of prisoners. It's true that they were kind of jealous of the people on a vegan diet. For a couple of reasons. First of all, because like food in prison is cooked in huge quantities. It's cooked en masse, and so that affects the quality. Whereas because there were a lot fewer vegans, that food was cooked in smaller amounts, and so it was better prepared. It was nicer. So that's one reason, and the other reason was that we got a kind of goodie bag. because we got soy milk, and we got peanut butter, didn't we? Yeast extracts. We got raisins, and we got peanuts. We got things like in a goodie bag.
The lovely Vicon, which you don't like.
The Vicon, yeah. Well, I kind of yeah. I'm not a massive fan of
Well,
Vicon. I think
I've got 2 jars of it in my kitchen right now.
have you? It's
How did that work with like trades? Did that mean
well,
that like the
what?
stuff you had was more valuable?
Well, no. What happened was, you see, like the currency in prison is tobacco. You
Tobacco,
see,
yeah.
and what would happen is you'd get these you'd get prisoners that weren't vegan join in the vegan society so they could get a vegan diet, so they could sell the contents of the goodie bag to other
Right, I'm
prisoners.
with you.
Because there was a vegan guy in one of the prisons I was in. I think in the very last prison I was in, and he was a weightlifter, and he was a really good weightlifter for his weight, because it's with weightlifting it's a bit like boxing. They have different categories according to a person's weight. And for his weight, he was the second best weightlifter in the country. And they used to let him out. Well, I think a prison officer would go with him, and he'd go to these different weightlifting competitions around the country. And so he kind of needed more protein than the average person, to kind of sustain his muscles and all that. So he used to buy people's peanut butter and people's peanuts and stuff like that. And so you'd get these kind of non-vegans who signed up to the vegan society to get the goodie bag, and then they'd go and sell the peanut butter to him and get tobacco from him for the peanut butter. You see, and so that kind of thing that used to go on. Um, and
I used to get loads of stamps of people because I used to go and buy an ounce of tobacco from the canteen, but I didn't smoke, and so I was able to trade it, and you get double the value of whatever.
oh yes,
Mm.
oh yes. I mean um, and it's great if you don't smoke. I mean, funny enough, I actually gave up smoking on my last prison sentence, which is probably quite unusual. I think there's probably people who take up smoking when they get
Yeah,
prison.
that's pretty remarkable, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
if
absolutely.
if you don't smoke, you're in a really good position, because with most of the prisoners, all their all their earnings, that because obviously in prison, you earn money from working in the workshops or whatever, you know, and then it was only a few pounds a week back in the day, and with most prisoners, almost all of that would go on tobacco. That would be spent.
I got a great tobacco story from prison, but it's a bit long, so I'll leave it, I think.
Oh,
It's about when we had that standoff in a cell. I was in this cell, and this newcomer wanted some tobacco off somebody, and he wouldn't give it to him by claiming he didn't have any, and it was there on his table. Anyway, it's too long to tell in detail. Andy, have you finished then with your World War II, do you think?
Yeah, unless anyone wanted to bring up anything else. I mean, I just always thought when I used to tell that story that just the fact that it had happened during World War II was significant until I really started thinking about what that actually meant. Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, pretty remarkable, isn't it? In the sense that people probably don't remember that they had rationing, and that that was another thing that the vegan society were trying to do, because rationing went on after the war. In fact,
yes.
I think rationing went on until the 60s, I think, as far as I remember.
Yeah, for a long time afterwards, yeah.
Yeah, and so the vegetarians would get extra this, that, and the other, like butter and this kind of stuff. But the vegans were excluded from all that. So that was, again, one of the first campaigns of the Vegan Society to try and get some equity with the vegetarians, which was interesting. One thing that Donald Watson, now for people watching, Donald Watson is the best known of the co-founders of the vegan social movement. He's credited with coining the word, along with his then kind of partner and then wife, Dorothy. So he came up with the idea of vegan as a word. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. And so he was always saying, with regard to vegetarians, we should criticize and attack vegetarianism, but never vegetarians themselves. And so that's always been a principle of mine, in the sense that what you find is that a lot of people on a vegetarian diet are quite ignorant of some of the practices that create some of the animal derived products that they eat, right? And so half the time, I mean, vegetarians can be a bit stubborn, but half the time it's because they don't know.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and vegans say that on social media all the time. I was a vegetarian for so and so years. I just didn't know
Mm.
about. Yeah, which again is remarkable. Because I think some people in the activist movement are kind of, well, people have got no excuse now because nobody can not know. But it's not really the case. I mean, if you're tuned into it and you're watching the documentaries, especially if you're doing it over and over, then you're going to know all the details. But there's going to be a lot of people, including vegetarians and the general public, who go out of their way not to know because knowing is too painful for them.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, if you're not exposed to the information, you're not going to know. I mean, I didn't know, but I mean I became vegetarian in '69, and I thought that was it. I thought that I kind of thought cows, had to be milked, and um, that hens laid eggs in the fields and people just collected them. I didn't realise, the true horror of how those products come about. Um, but there was no vegan information around at that time, at all, really. I mean, how I became vegan was I picked up a copy of the Vegetarian Society's magazine, and there was an article in there, about veganism, and that's how I found out about it. Otherwise, I would have never known, because it's not obvious. It's not an obvious thing that you'd think about, because those products aren't actually, the body of an animal, are they? Part of the body of an animal. And I think these days, yeah, there's a lot more vegan information around these days in all sorts of forms, but it's whether people come across that, whether they're exposed to it, I suppose, which is why it's so important for us to do lots and lots more vegan outreach, so we can reach all these people.
I wondered whether you get onto that, Ronnie.
I was waiting for it. I mean, you've done quite
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
What's that, about half an hour or so?
Half an hour, yeah. I
Yeah.
held back. I held back for half an hour before I said the.
Yeah, that's pretty good going, that, Ronnie.
Yeah, but that's true, though, isn't it? It's true information. It's just that these people, I mean, if we could sort of target vegetarians, it would be great, because a lot of them probably think that they're doing all they need to do. I did. I did when I was a vegetarian. I thought, well, that's me sorted. I'm not contributing to animals being killed and exploited, and that's it then. And then when I found out about the egg and dairy industry, obviously I was horrified. And
Well,
then
I think some vegans are more critical of vegetarians than they are of flesh consumers, because they kind of almost think, well, you get some of it, but how come you?
there are some vegetarians who do know, but do are sort of, I don't know, either try not to think about it, or kind of just to refuse to go any further. I mean, I've known vegetarians like that were fully aware of these things, and yet
You've even got
yeah,
vegetarians now, right? And they're complaining to restaurants that they've switched to a vegan menu, and they're complaining that they've, as it were, veganized the vegetarian dishes, and they're upset by that.
yeah, and I find that really strange, that if those people are vegetarian out of concern for other animals, and what happens to other animals, that they don't appreciate the like the importance of veganism. I think if those vegetarians are vegetarian, maybe for health reasons, or something like that, that would explain it more. But if they're vegetarian for the reason I was vegetarian, because of the animals, then you'd think that they would be happy that those dishes had been veganized, so to speak.
Indeed. Okay, so now in 1944, this is November now. Some people meet. It might have been the month before. You might know this, Andy, and decide on a group. It's still unnamed at the time, and then Donald Watson goes and produces the vegan news, which is the first bulletin, which is just really a Gestetner 4 sheets of paper, which is kind of written very kind of closely. No pictures or anything like that. No illustrations. It's just pure kind of writing. And one thing which is interesting to me, at least, about the history is the fact that you had a group of people who decided that they would start a cause. But I think Watson was the first to realize that, well, in that case, we're going to have to do something. And what we'll do is we'll publish a newsletter. And so he started doing that. And so, in a sense, he became the treasurer and, you know, the chairperson and the main writer and all this kind of stuff for quite a long time. And everybody else kind of had to catch up with him, right? And so that was pretty interesting. And he said in the first one, he said, there's a particular reason why we formed our group. And he said he thinks it's the first group of in the world, so the first vegan group. And he basically said he had 2 ideas, which is in this little bulletin, which is really good. First of all, it was an idea called ripening up. And he's basically saying that people need to be ripened up, or we would just say educated, in terms of stuff they don't know. It's not as though they're going to trip over this information. You know, somebody's got to, as it were, give it to them in the form of something or other. You know, I mean, you know, a lot of people, as you know, Ronnie, that got into the movement because they received a leaflet back in the 70s and 80s and stuff. But that was a form of ripening up. And basically Watson said, you know, Edward Chadwick and Lord Shaftesbury, Charles Kingsley, they were the ones who brought about health reforms through clean water and stuff, which was a rarity at the time. And he said, and also, let me see, Wilberforce, the anti-slavery leader, if you like, they didn't wait around for people to be ready for their message. They gave their message out. And just like with veganism, when they first started talking about anti-slavery or purifying the water, this kind of stuff, there was a heck of a lot of opposition and ridicule. But it's a question of, you know, people have got to hear a message, then you've got to hear it again, a little bit like advertising, and then eventually people might consider it, you know, but they're not just going to stumble on it, as it were, in that sense. And he also said that we can't leave our ideas to prosperity because they were big on the idea of moral evolution. And they said that what we need to do through veganism is morally improve as humanity. And we can't just leave that to chance. We've got to kind of guide it and be kind of prime movers in change. And he said that this is because evolution can be progressive and cause good, but it also can be regressive. So if you don't do anything, then things might even get worse, right? And so I think those are really kind of interesting insights. I mean, somebody, for example, said just today on social media that veganism is a non-action. And I replied by saying there's nothing in the writings of the founders of our movement to suggest that it's a non-action. In fact, if anything, it implies that we should be active and do something, you know, especially when Watson said in 1945, just a few months after the group was formed, that veganism was about opposing the exploitation of sentient life. So it seems to me that, you know, if we're supposed to be opposing, that implies action to me.
Yeah, it implies an active element to veganism, doesn't it? That it's not just about avoidance, that it's also about spreading the message as well.
Yeah, would you not argue that if it was simply about avoidance, that obviously we wouldn't know about it and we wouldn't be having this conversation now? Because without action, without talking about it, without spreading the word, what
Yeah,
would
and
it be?
don't forget. I mean, like one of the first things that they did, especially the women in the movement, funny enough, is they went on kind of lecture tours
Mm,
of Britain and Ireland in particular. It it makes me think. I mean, I'm based in Dublin right now, but it makes you think what people of the very early 50s would have made of the vegan argument in Ireland, especially rural Ireland. That must have been quite interesting. You want to be a fly on the wall in one of those meetings.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's really interesting that a number of them, Donald, in fact, himself, for about 7 or 8 years after founding the Vegan Society, remained very close with the Vegetarian Society. A number of them still worked within them or continued their roles as secretary and that sort of stuff. And it helped bring members across.
Yeah, I also think that, I mean, this idea went right the way through to, I'd say, the 90s. And Ronnie might know better than me, but vegetarianism was often seen as a gateway to, animal liberation and veganism. Whereas now that idea, in other words, people would say go vegetarian first, which of
Mm,
course we would never say now.
yeah. Well, some people possibly would still say it was the stepping stone, but yeah, for the most part, it's now more of a roadblock, isn't it, than a stepping stone?
Yeah. Also, I mean, like when people used to start volunteering in the stalls in Dublin, so vegetarians would often come up and announce that they were vegetarian because they kind of wanted praise, and that's why I made that little joke saying, "Oh, don't worry, there's a cure for that," right? But they wanted kind of affirmation that they were doing something great, and some of the people used to say, "Oh, that's really good, you're almost there," and of course, modern day vegans would never say that either now.
No.
I think it kind of depends on, um, yeah, you see, if someone's a vegetarian because they're concerned about, what happens to the other animals, then then I suppose you could say that in a way is a stepping stone. But you see, if those people already know what happens with the dairy industry and the egg industry, then the question is why are they still vegetarian and not vegan? It's
Although I
yeah.
think vegetarianism has changed a bit. I think a lot of vegetarians now might be on the plant milks and that as well, and maybe even the vegan cheese. Of course, we know through research and also anecdotally that cheese is one of the real problems.
Mm.
We've been asked in the chat, do you gentlemen, well, not been called that for a while, know Julia Hawkins? I don't.
Julia Hawkins. The name is slightly familiar. I'm not really.
Yeah, I recognize the name, but not enough to say,
Yeah.
yeah, that's this person. No.
No. I
No,
wouldn't say.
no.
Yeah. That you see, I think there are a lot of people who 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 the only thing that they still eat that's an animal product is dairy cheese. That
Yeah.
they're on the plant milk. It's just that the cheese thing seems to be, the kind of that's what I find a lot on when I'm doing outreach stalls. People go on about on about cheese.
And do you use the casomorphin thing?
No, no, I don't use that at all. I just say that that you know that what they're trying. I'd say what you're trying to do is find a vegan cheese that's the same as the dairy cheese, but that isn't the way. That isn't the way to approach it. The way to approach it is to say, I'm not going to eat the dairy cheese because of the consequences of that. Because basically, when I'm doing that, I'm basically paying someone to kill other animals, right? Because of the cause of an effect of the demand created by eating that cheese. So what you've got to do is say, right, no, I'm not going to eat the dairy cheese, and having made a decision not to eat the dairy cheese, then I'm going to then look for something to replace it. I'm not going to wait till I can find something suitable to replace it before I give it up.
No, that's a really great point, to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah. Because people are doing it the wrong way around. They go, I can't find a vegan cheese that's as nice as the dairy cheese. And I say, well, look, that is you're approaching it the wrong way. You're approaching it the wrong. And I talk about myself, about. I mean, back in the day, there weren't any. There were no over-the-counter vegan cheeses, so to speak. There were no over-the-counter non-dairy cheeses like you've got. There's loads of them now, and so people used to make their own. Some people used to make their own out of kind of cashew nuts, and then there was the one that we used to make out of it. There was a hard, solid vegan margarine suitable vegans in those days, and we used to melt it, stir in some soya flour, put some yeast extract in, let it set, and that was our cheese.
Lovely
And
diarrhea colour it was.
well, it was, but I used to think it was all right. With a bit of onion and pickle. I used to think it was all right.
No, it was all right. It was very nice. I liked
Yeah,
it.
yeah. You see, but it wasn't. It didn't taste the same as dairy cheese. It had its own taste, had its own rather, I thought nice flavour. That's what we used to have.
Going back
But
to one thing you just
yeah,
said, Ronnie, is the fact that I said earlier on that vegans often say, "Oh, people have got no excuse to be ignorant now," and all that. One of the main things that vegetarians used to say in Dublin when they came to the stall was that they didn't even know that vegan cheese existed.
Mm.
And you think, well, how could that be possible?
Well, also you've mentioned this before, Roger, but quite a lot of people I speak to as well, especially vegetarians, will say, "Oh yeah, I tried a vegan
oh yeah,
cheese in
15 years ago. Yeah.
2001, and it smelt horrible, so I'll never try another one." And it's like, do you know how ridiculous that is? Do you know how far they've come in just the last 6 months, let alone the last
but
15
but,
years?
but say there were no vegan cheeses at all, right?
Okay, I'll say that. There's no vegan cheeses at
No
all.
vegan cheeses. Well, that is not
But
a
no, you're
reason.
absolutely right. If you're working on the premise of I'm
Yeah,
not going to consume dairy
yeah,
because
yeah,
there's rights
exactly.
violations involved, whether there's a
Yeah,
plant-based alternative or not is actually
makes
irrelevant.
no
You're
difference.
just lucky in the fact that there is one. Yeah.
Because if you're looking at I mean, cheese of any sort is not a healthy food, whether it's dairy cheese or whether it's you know
Yeah,
the
that's another thing that people used
yeah,
to do. They'd come up and
yeah,
look at the samples, read the ingredients, and go, "This doesn't look very healthy." And I said, "Well, that's not the idea of any cheese to be healthy."
no, it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
They're
good
kind of
point.
they're kind of it's
I mean, it's a junk food,
very
isn't it?
hard.
All of
Yeah,
cheese is
it's
a junk food.
yeah. You see, so of course, you don't need it if you're looking at it as some, you know, I don't know how much protein's in cheese, but if you're looking at it as source of protein, there's loads of um, there's loads of other protein that you can get from plants, isn't there? You don't need to eat cheese for your protein. So there you go. I mean, I'm not keen. I mean, I much prefer hummus to any of the to any of the vegan cheeses. To be quite
Yeah, and
honest.
I mean that does bring us back to one of the things that I wanted to mention, although we've skipped forward a little bit to Plamil, but like again going back to the foundation, you know, even like Leslie Cross in what 51 is talking about how, and then again repeated in the Surge of Freedom, but I'm sure it's 51 the first time he mentions it. It's the real need to have a plant-based milk alternative that's reliable and tastes okay that they can recommend to people. So for all these years they didn't even have a an actual milk replacement. They just avoided it completely.
No, some people would make um, uh, a kind of milk out of cashew nuts.
Mm.
That would be that
But
used to be.
I can
Yeah,
imagine that, like, I mean, that might have been okay in
yeah,
like 48, 49, 50. But I would
yeah.
imagine things like cashews during the war were almost impossible to get an abundance of to make milk with.
Yeah, I think it would have been difficult because of course they're from other countries, aren't they?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, especially like with rations and everything else. It's not like you can just walk into a whole food shop now and buy a big bag and take them home and
No,
blend them. It's just not that, you
but
know.
but in fact, the easiest way, and I don't know whether any of the sort of early vegans kind of thought of this, but the easiest way of making plant milk is from oats,
Yeah.
and it's really really quick and simple, and oats would have been sort of
Yeah,
widely
but
available.
I think the answer to that, Ronnie, is that they had morally ruled it out, as you're suggesting, and so they weren't even looking
Yeah, they weren't looking for them, were they? They were looking. I mean, even when Leslie Cross talks about it, he's not saying we're desperate for this product. He's saying we need to have one for mothers, for
Yeah,
these kind of situations where there is, there's no way around it. We need to actually have an alternative for them. Yeah, they weren't saying we really miss cheese and can someone invent one. They were
yeah, because
seeing the problems that would
yeah,
come down the road. Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a lot more products where you need a kind of milk type substance in them. Like you've got your cereals and you've got your, stuff like that, haven't you? I mean, you've got your cup of tea, where people are used to having milk in stuff, even more so than cheese in a sense. And so I think that's where it was.
Well,
I mean, I
it's only,
remember.
it's only in some cultures, though, Ronnie. I mean,
Uh, yes, I mean,
black tea is a staple in lots of places, right?
Yeah,
doesn't
and obviously
it?
we've also got a factor in, which
Yeah,
brings me back to one of the other things I wanted to mention is when they launched the society, when they were having these conversations, what they were considering sort of like high level or industrial agriculture is nothing like what exists today. They weren't talking about like factory farming or these mass feedlots. They were talking about what people call small scale farms, and
yes,
so dairy really until sort of like the early 50s was nothing like a real industry. It was the war that really perpetuated most of these dairy plants being built and formulated. So like when they were having these conversations, a lot of people probably didn't have milk all that often anyway, or they'd have like a punnet of butter that would last them months, for example, and those kind of things. It would be used sparingly. It's not like people would have these products in abundance like they do now. It's not like milk powder would have been in everything going like it is now. So they wouldn't have had any of these other issues to deal with.
No, I mean it's like I mean in those days the eating of chicken flesh was a luxury then, wasn't
it
it?
was.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when when I was a boy, um, that we only ever had chicken at Christmas at home. We didn't have a turkey. We had a chicken, and it was considered a luxury.
Was Turkey still like the tradition, but for rich people?
I think it might have been. It
That
might.
that that makes for like common
I think
sense in the sense of you
may
don't
Well,
have.
afford
the rich
turkey or
people would
chicken would
go
be
for
there.
game,
They'd
Yeah.
probably go for
or
it,
goose.
why we didn't have a turkey. I'm not sure. It might have been because my parents didn't like the taste of turkey. I'm not really sure. But that was the only time I think we ever had chicken. And then a bit later on, as I was growing up, and you kind of started having more of the proliferation of supermarkets then. And I know my mum used to get this chicken pie from the supermarket, but that was kind of in later years. But when I was a younger child, the only time we ever had chicken was at Christmas because it was an expensive. It was
Ronnie is a young child just out of
as
the
a young
egg.
child, yeah,
Hey,
only slightly
Andy,
smaller than I
going
am.
back to what you were saying
Yeah.
about the oh yeah, one of the weird things about vegan movement history was the fact that, as you said, the intensification of dairy was the first, and so that's why there's a big focus on non-dairy vegetarians,
Yeah.
right? And yet when they talked about it in their letters and that, they talked about without eggs and without dairy, that kind of stuff. But they became known as the non-dairy vegetarians because I think, I mean, this is before the theory of animal rights, right? And so I think they would have struggled a bit more to give reasons why they would be opposed to, a couple of chickens scratching around in somebody's yard, right? Compared with the growing intensification of dairy. So I think that explains that part of vegan history, which is interesting.
Oh yes, I mean, the intensification of chickens has been something that's. I mean, that's why uh, but chicken flesh is so cheap and so prolific these days because of the intensification and because they're produced so cheaply. And it's the same with eggs as well. Same with eggs. You've got the
But
you know
that started at the end of the war, didn't it?
Well, I think it's something that's that 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 started then and has increased ever since. You know, and I think that's why these products are massively um, less expensive now than they used to be. You know, because these animals are bred and kept in such huge numbers.
Hmm. Well, we're over the hour. I don't know how long we've planned on this. We hadn't actually talked about it. Do you
Well,
want to do you want to return to the RSPCA
Yeah, I was
question?
going to say, do you want to do that comment
yes,
before we forget?
we'll cover that, and then I'm going to have to go. I'm going to have to go by 10:30 myself.
Yeah,
So
to be fair, I was going to go till 10:30. That's what I
yeah,
thought it
yeah,
would go to. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, how come the RSPCA don't promote veganism?
Well, I mean, quite bluntly, because they're not a vegan organization and they don't hold vegan ethics. They're an animal welfare charity that exists to make sure that animals that are already within the exploitation system, whatever that is, are treated in a proper way, and to care for people's companion animals and free living beings that are injured by cars or traps or emergency relief, so to speak. They don't exist to promote veganism.
No, and
Yeah.
Ronnie, you'll know this, right? Is that I mean, the RSPCA in the early days when I was a vegan never talked about animal
No,
farming, did they?
um, no, they were really thought of as being a dog and cat organisation that kind of were concerned about um, were concerned about like cruelty, so to speak, of that occurred to dogs and cats, and you've got the RSPCA, the central RSPCA, and then you've got a lot of RSPCA branches who are kind of pretty much like semi-independent from the RSPCA itself, and all those branches, their concern almost exclusively is dogs and cats, and also other animals that
Although
people.
I knew a branch in Liverpool that was run by vegans, so there you go.
Yeah,
There's not. There's one not too
yeah,
far away from me and Ronnie that's also run by vegans. But the problem is when you look at kind of like the calls or the cases that they get handed to or get brought in by the members of the public, it's predominantly dogs and cats. And
oh
so
yeah,
even when they want to apply some vegan ethics somewhere, they're so sort of inundated with all these other things that, well, what can they do? I mean,
yeah.
let's be honest. We're talking about a charity that already can't deal with the dogs and cats and other animal problem without factoring in
But
farmed animals.
Well,
that,
I mean, but that begs the question: why did they bother then with the farmed animal bit?
Because they get money for saying that it's okay and it makes the farms look good.
Well, I don't think it's a
And
lot. I don't think it's a lot of money. I mean, the way that I see it, and I think it's a really simple model for people to think about this issue, is that you've got three or maybe three or four categories. The first one is traditional animal welfare. So that's where the RSPCA are, the same as the Humane Society of the United States, this kind of stuff. So these are the non-vegan cat and dog brigade, as we used to call them, and everything, right? And so they don't pretend to be vegan. They don't stand for vegan. They don't aspire to be vegan. Then you've got so that's traditional welfare. Then you've got a category called new welfare or neo welfare. Now those are people like Peter who will use welfare language and welfare ideas in order to get to abolition. Or at least that's what they hope. They've got this kind of a bit of a kind of model that welfare plus welfare plus welfare will eventually equal rights, right? So you've got those in the middle, the more radical, but still got a lot of welfare about them. And then you've got animal liberation and animal rights, which don't usually get involved with welfare at all. So the majority of the vegan movement are really in that scenario, that spectrum, are new welfarists, right? Because the majority language of the vegan movement is welfarist in nature. It's about cruelty and abuse and all the rest of it, and all that. The same language as the RSPCA, right? But vegans would say that they're completely different from the RSPCA, but they use the same language. Okay, it's the rights people and the liberationists who use the language of liberation and rights, and they don't tend to use welfare language. So those are that's the spectrum that I kind of tend to use in order to understand a group like the RSPCA. And as you said, Andy, they're nothing to do with veganism, but they don't pretend to be either.
No, no, they never have.
No, they don't. And I think that what we're seeing and you know what I find concerning, because I see it as a diversion really, is this kind of focus on the RSPCA in particular, you know, by vegans, aimed at getting the RSPCA to drop their
Yeah.
assured RSPCA assured label that they give to particular farms that they say have got higher welfare standards than other farms. And I think the thinking of the vegans involved in, I mean, for instance, Animal Rising have just announced that their next campaign is going to be against the RSPCA and to get them to drop that assured label. And I think their thinking is, well, if the, by having these assured labels on animal products, that is kind of maybe giving people an excuse to continue consuming animal products. It kind of, you know, kind of eases their conscience, perhaps, so to speak. And so, if these,
I totally agree. I think all of this is about consumer comfort at the end of the
yes,
day.
that
That's what
consumer,
it's
yeah,
designed for. And
and
like,
so if,
so to go back, maybe it's not so much the money that the RSPCA get out of it, but they get to pass the buck, right? So it's no longer their responsibility. Like they only go and oversee this, and at the end of the day, there's only so much they can do. And it's kind of the same with what the vegans, and I mean, I hate to say it, but Joey is kind of leading the charge at the moment. That's what they're trying to do. They want to pass this book back to the RSPCA and try and hold them account for something that they've never claimed to do. And actually, if they genuinely care about welfare, then having the RSPCA remove all those stamps isn't going to benefit the animals in any way, shape, or form. All it will allow for a group, just for example, they could bring in Green Tractor, which is a farmers union run group, which basically, you know, checks itself, and that's the new RSPCA. All the same kind of consumer comforts for the people that are buying the flesh, but in terms of the actual welfare for the animals, it would probably get far worse. So
Do
no,
you
I think
think
it's
the
a complete
argument
waste of
then,
our time.
Ronnie and Andy, do you think the argument of the people who are having a go at the RSPCA, that if without the assured labels, people will consider a plant-based diet? Do you think
No,
that's a
no,
non-starter?
I don't think that's the case at all.
no, I mean, I think that's what they're, I think that they're thinking, well, people are using this RSPCA assured thing as an excuse to continue, as a sort of salve to their conscience, so that they can continue consuming animal
Yeah, and
products.
therefore they
That's
will
the
stop
truth.
consuming. But is that right though?
I think that there's, uh, I think in most cases that wouldn't be the case. I think,
I mean,
especially,
let's look at it this way.
yeah.
How long would it take, just hypothetically, if we had like some sort of magic alien ray gun now that we sprayed out and it removed every RSPCA assured label, sticker, piece of memorabilia from existence? How long would it even take the general public to notice?
Well, it would take a while for them to notice, but also
Yeah, right. So there's
yeah,
the first problem. They
yeah.
don't care enough to even pay attention to the fact that the labels already exist.
But
That
that's
consumer
not the
comfort
argument.
is
The
so
argument
ingrained
is
in their head that they don't care.
no, but that can't be right, because the argument is that people actually seek out the things with the RSPCA. I mean, that's what Ronnie's kind of alluding to.
I mean,
That
they
they
might have done once upon a time, but I think when most people go shopping, they buy the same things that they usually buy. And so, like, as we just said, if you zapped all those labels off, most people would take weeks or months to even notice that that sticker wasn't there anymore, because they're just so accustomed to those things.
The,
But
uh,
also, we've also got to factor in, like, if you went to somewhere like Tesco or Sainsbury's, they've got their own versions of this high welfare nonsense, which have got nothing to do with the RSPCA.
yes,
well,
and then
I think that's the
yeah,
strongest argument against it. Georgie is saying, I definitely heard flesh consumers say they specifically buy RSPCA assured products.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the same as the people that come in here and say, well, I'm against factory farming, so I get all of my eggs from my uncle down the road.
but I think the big question is if those are those people in their head saying, I am going to buy, let's say, if I say, I'm going to buy beef and I'm going to try to buy my beef from an RSPCA assured source, right? Because if that's their mental approach, then if there's no RSPCA assured source, they're still going to buy the beef, aren't they? If you see what I mean, they'll say, well, look, I'm going to try and get it from, a higher welfare source, doing my bit, I'm going to try and do it. But say that higher welfare source isn't there, that doesn't mean that they are then going to not buy beef at all. If you see what I mean. If
Yeah,
they're,
absolutely. And you could
yeah,
test that in various other methods. But just say you had like a snack van that was famous for this particular product and people sat in the queue all day. And when they got there, it had run out. They're not just going to walk away. They're still going to buy something. That's what the
yeah,
data tells us. So, yeah, it's the same with these people. If, for example, they go to Tesco and they actually haven't got, I don't know, this particular slice in with an RSPCA sticker, they're just going to buy the one that's the similar price. They're not
yeah.
going to care. They're not going to go, oh, forget it then, I'll go home.
Yeah.
No one's doing that.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that there's so many problems with it. There's so much doubt as to whether these campaigns towards the RSPCA are going to actually make any difference at all. There's so much doubt surrounding that, isn't there? That surely the better use of the energy of all those vegans that are involved in those campaigns is to go and educate other people to become vegan.
Yeah, but there's another element there which addresses that, Ronnie. First of all, you've got this thing that there's this argument that consumer behavior will be altered if the RSPCA assured labels are not there. But then you've got this other thing that they hope that the RSPCA will turn into an organization that does promote veganism. And therefore, because they've got a great reputation, that means that there's going to be more people taking veganism more seriously, right? So that's the other side of.
You see, the thing is, if you were really going to want the RSPCA to promote veganism, then the campaign to do that would need to be completely different to that sort of campaign, because basically you've got people on the RSPCA board, their ruling body, whatever it's called, board or council, I'm not quite sure what they call it, the people that lay down the policy for the RSPCA. Now, if those people themselves, and a lot of those people themselves aren't vegan, then how are they going to come to a decision that the RSPCA is going to promote veganism?
I think the idea is to shame them into being vegan, Ronnie.
Yeah, that's not going to happen, is it? And on that note, though, I mean, it's funny that for 12 years, I think, something along those lines. I know he's only been president now for 18 months or whatever it is, but Chris Packham has been the vice president and now president of the RSPCA as a vegan. So, like,
I don't think he can determine policy.
no, exactly that. So, what are they? If the guy at the very top now, in the highest position, cannot make any changes, what difference do they think that screaming outside of an office in London is going to make?
The only way you're going to make a difference is similar but much more difficult, I think, than what some of us did way back in the 1970s. Because at the time, in the 1970s, the RSPCA was not opposed to hunting. It was not opposed. It didn't promote hunting. It didn't say that hunting was okay, but it wasn't opposed to hunting. And when the RSPCA was asked, "Are you opposed to hunting?" they said, "No, we're not. We don't have a policy on it." So therefore, the hunters, particularly the fox hunters, would be saying all the time, hunting must be okay because the RSPCA aren't against it, and the RSPCA are against cruelty. So if they're not against hunting, then hunting's not cruel. You see, and so because that was that was so damaging, or considered to be so damaging, to the anti-hunt movement. There was a concerted campaign to get the RSPCA to change that policy, and there was a group formed called the RSPCA Reform Group, and what the RSPCA Reform Group did was, over a few years, they recruited and promoted candidates to stand for positions on the RSPCA's ruling council, and they encouraged a lot of anti-hunt people to join the RSPCA so they could vote for the anti-hunt candidates.
Yeah.
And
There's a problem with what you're
yeah,
saying, Ronnie, because if
yeah,
you're going to go on to say, therefore, you could use that same method, it's just that
yes,
most people were opposed to hunting in the country.
yes,
That's a
yeah.
massive difference.
That's why it would be much more difficult to do it that way. I mean, in theory, you could do it if you were if you encourage loads of vegans to join the RSPCA and vote for vegan candidates and get an RSPCA council where the majority of them were like, were like kind of, you know, you know, kind of strong ethical vegans. Then you could you could in theory do the same, but it's just the amount of effort that would take.
What they'd say there is their membership would completely plummet,
Yeah.
right, if that
Oh,
happened.
oh yes, yes. It probably would, because with the hunting thing, it made no difference. Most people in that country, as you say, opposed to hunting, have been for decades. Yes, I think that that may well, but that's the only way you do it. That if you wanted them to change their policy so that they promoted veganism, that's the only realistic way to do it. You'd have to replace the non-vegan um, uh, board members with vegans, and that would be a long and difficult process. And it's a question of, is that the best
Yeah,
use
the
of our
best
resources?
use of resources.
Yeah,
Also, if say it worked, right, then the good reputation, as it's known now, would have changed, because the rhetoric then would be that, oh, the RSPCA has been taken over by a bunch of militants. It's not the RSPCA anymore, and all that. And so the reputational kind of that it has now would disappear too, wouldn't it?
Everything that they do would have to change. Everything. Because they work with ethical dog breeders and ethical cat breeders and ethical parrot breeders, not to mention just the food aspects.
yeah. I
Like,
mean,
everything about what they do would have to change. You'd more or less be better off just setting up the RSPCA 2 and starting from scratch than
Yeah.
trying to
Okay. So
change that
here's a question
infrastructure.
then: Is because they concentrate on those things, is it a good thing or a bad thing that traditional animal welfare groups exist?
I, I mean, I think there's, I think there's arguments both ways on it.
I've always thought it's a good thing,
It's
because
not. It's not. It's not about. I mean, I think. I think it's undervalued the good work that the RSPCA do with free living beings and the money they spend in terms of bailing out rescues and all this kind of stuff. Like, I don't. I don't want to make
there's
out
an
that they're
argument that
just.
they've kind of spreading themselves too thin by
Yeah, I
getting.
mean, at the end of the day, I think one of the things that people don't seem to take into consideration all the time is that they're not an authority; they are a charity. So yeah, okay, they're quite a popular, and sort of in terms of equity, they've got a few quid in the bank, but they are still a charity with no actual derived authority from anywhere. So at the end of the day, they've got no more power than you or me. They've just got the ability to pay for a barrister or a solicitor to build a
No, but
case and take
they
someone's
do
cut.
rely on expertise, though, don't they?
Yeah,
And
of
they
course.
are.
But what? There's a lot to ask them to do to potentially be in charge of all the UK's wildlife and all of the companion animals that people can't look after, and observe every farm that they, claim to. It's just an impossible task.
Yeah, it's kind of like the RSPCA don't do anything well anymore because they're too stretched, right?
I would agree that's potentially, yeah, a fair criticism, that it's kind of like they're an inch deep and a mile wide, and that's part of the problem.
But I mean, they are driven by animal welfare science, and
Yes.
one of the things that the activists have either forgotten or tend not to know or ignore in some cases, is the fact that groups like PETA, they campaigned for the gas chambers to be brought in
Yeah.
on animal welfare grounds, right? And they led the campaign in Canada, actually, clean like this, pressurizing KFC to bring in gas chambers for chickens, right? And so they were part of this thing about being led by animal welfare science. And so the gas chambers, which all the vegans now complaining about, but they're not complaining about it on animal rights grounds. They're complaining about it on animal welfare grounds. You know, that it's terribly cruel and everything. But that's supposed to be less cruel than what was previously there, which was the electrified tongs.
Yeah.
Okay. But
Yeah,
now,
and actually, it was the RSPCA that were challenging this and were one of the leading challengers when they were putting this forward because they didn't believe the science at the time and they were convinced by Peter's research. So, yeah.
yeah, and now the RSPCA are part of, I think, 60 groups who are calling for another way of stunning the pigs because they found out that the welfare improvement that was promised through gassing has not come about.
Yeah.
Right. But with people like Temple Grandin, who is like an animal welfare authority,
Apparently.
she claims that the electrified tongs are the most humane if they're used properly. But because they're under pressure, time pressure, they're never used properly. And so therefore that makes the gas chambers more humane, even though they're still really problematic. It's just that people don't take the care to electrify the pigs for long enough to render them sufficiently unconscious. And so therefore, once they've been hauled into the air, they often regain consciousness, right? And so in that sense, the gas chambers are supposed to be a welfare benefit.
Yeah, and the irony of that, I suppose, if you can call it such, is that one of the arguments against gas chambers is that, especially towards the end of the day, these pigs are overloaded into the lift, and so they climb on each other's backs, and the gas doesn't work, and so again they're alive and like, well, not alive but conscious, aware. So yeah, so the same argument as what she's saying, human error is a possibility. So if these things aren't done properly, it's exactly the same problem. The issue is that it's happening, not the method.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's it. But I mean, I did a report, I think it was 2006, I think, when the research was going through this kind of, it was called Control Atmosphere Stunning. And the scientists were having great difficulty in getting it right, even in laboratory situations. And they said that they need to create turbulence, as they called it, in the gas chambers in order for pockets of air not to build up. And when you were saying that they're jumping on each other's backs and everything, that would create these pockets of air. And so then you'd have a couple of individual snouts, as it were, who are not getting the gas, they're getting the air.
Yeah, and then just in case anyone isn't aware, the reason that this is significant is because these pigs are lowered down in these chambers because the gas is very heavy. So it sits at the bottom of the chamber, which is why they're lowered down. So if they climb onto the backs of the others, sometimes it's almost like you were drowning in a ship that's sinking and you've managed to find a small pocket of air that you've got your head into. And so the gas isn't having any effect.
Well, what it basically means is it's probably having less effect.
Well, less effect, yeah. I mean, I suppose it's still having some effect. It's still going to be burning their skin. It's just not essentially rendering them unconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. that's
Yeah, but
depressing way to end
as it is to end on.
yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a question of like, you know, welfareists are going to do welfare, but as vegans, you know, our focus should be on educating as many people as possible to become vegan,
Yeah.
and rather than being diverted into these issues that don't deal with the fundamental problem, as is, you know, like this campaign regarding the RSPCA.
No, but again, we've got that problem with that, Ronnie, which is that some of the campaigns are suggesting if we can get the RSPCA to advocate for veganism, that would have more effect than us doing it.
Yes, it's just the huge difficulties in. Yeah, I mean, if overnight you could click your fingers and the RSPCA advocated for veganism, that would be brilliant. But that isn't what would happen. It would be a long and difficult and complicated process, which would require so much resources, and then may not succeed. So it's once again we're back to what is the best use of our resources.
Indeed. Andy, I see that we're kind of spiraling here. So does that mean you've got a problem with your phone or something like that?
No,
Oh, okay. Can you not see the little dots moving around in the middle?
no, this seems fine for me.
All right.
But I'm going to have to go now, folks.
No, that's fine. I was just going to quickly say, did you want to do another one of these like next week and talk a bit more about this, or move into some of the ALF stuff? Because I mean,
Yes,
yeah.
great. Yeah, that would be
Okay.
really good.
Okay, cool. All right, we'll go for 9 next week. Then again next Wednesday.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent.
Thanks so much, everyone, for
Okay.
being here. Thanks, guys, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
Bye then. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
See you later. Take care.